They are training these journalists like sheep. Say it with me. Dismiss, distort, distract, dismay. I love it when I see someone that does what I do even better. And Mike Benz, when it comes to the important topic, the one I think is the most important, which is corruption in our institutions, is leagues ahead of me. He is leagues ahead of me. And it is absolutely brilliant. And I cannot, if you like what I talk about and things like corruption in our institutions, you should stop listening to me right now and listen to Mike Benz, because he is more well-researched. He presents it in a more level-headed way than me. I think he's absolutely fantastic. A good place to start would be his interview with Tucker Carlson from a few months ago, and then his interview with Tucker Carlson just the other day here. It is absolutely phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal how he brings the receipts and is able to go through just how dangerous censorship of free speech on the internet is, and how there's this sort of statecraft institutions of foreign policy in the United States and globally in our European allies that are making a full-throated push for censorship of things that go against particularly right-wing populists. It is unbelievable. Atlantic Council will do all these speeches which no one covers. Journalists aren't covering, and you'll understand why, because this presentation is a 9-hour speech that Mike Benz viewed in 2019, right? And the audience for this speech is journalists. So there's some 200 journalists, legacy media people in the room, while two guys from the Atlantic Council, again, that's basically a cutout for the domestic arm of NATO, with all these former intel people from the United States, UK, etc. on, right? And they're talking to these journalists about how to censor the internet, how to censor arguments that they don't like. Now, you might say, but wait a minute, why would journalists be anti-free speech? Isn't that the rub? Now, if you followed remotely since 2016, you know that that's absolutely the case. And Mike Benz, in his previous reporting, particularly in his interviews with Tucker, has talked about the U.S. intelligence and statecraft was for free speech because it gave them easy access to countries where they wanted color revolutions and regime change. So if there's no internet, if there's no free speech, and you don't like the government of, say, Belarus, and you're the CIA, how do you infiltrate the people of Belarus to foment enough uprising so that they overthrow their own government? It becomes difficult. If the state controls all of the media, it makes that sort of changing hearts and minds that much more difficult. However, if you have a free and fair internet and things like Telegram where you could push these sorts of arguments to the people of that country by the millions, then it allows you easier access to have academics, implants, etc., good word, right on, to go in there and be able to change this. It makes it much easier. So the United States intel agencies loved a free and open internet and worked with the values of the United States of free speech. So they could say free speech is important, which it is, and say, oh, but we're going to use it to our advantage. Then what happened was in 2014 with Brexit and then with the election of Trump in 2016, they started to realize that that same free speech was detrimental to them back home. So then they had these sort of bifurcated argument. On one hand, depending on the country, they would say free speech is very important. And Mike Benz in the Tucker interview talks about this specifically with Brazil. Lula wins in Brazil, who is sort of who the U.S. State Department wants to win. And so the approach that's being taken is, well, Lula's censorship of X and of Bolsonaro, who was seen as a right-wing populist, that's okay. But had Bolsonaro won, the United States State Department, etc. officials' position would have been the complete opposite. They would have said free speech is so important, and Bolsonaro's trying to restrict it. For example, in Iran, we sanctioned Iran by claiming that they were anti-free speech. So when the country goes in the direction that the U.S. statecraft wants now, the official U.S. statecraft narrative is, oh, we don't need free speech anymore. We don't need voices counter to that. And this has been part and parcel to sort of how these sort of color revolutions in U.S. statecraft has been done for years. For example, Mike Benz talks about in the Tucker interview, when NATO goes into Yugoslavia in 95, one of the first things they did was bomb Yugoslavia's state media outlets. You might say, but isn't that a war crime? You can't just kill journalists. And they said, no, because they're actually enemies because they're propagandizing for the enemy, etc. So it was legitimate. So they understand the importance of controlling the narrative, places like our CIA. Totally get it. They understand it. So, of course, it makes sense that if you're not doing it with bombs and instead you're doing it with censorship, one of the first things you would target is regimes that the U.S. finds hostile. You'll say, we need free speech so people can speak up against that hostile regime. And then once the groups win that we like, and now you have free speech being used to attack them, like maybe Lula in Brazil, they say, no, we don't want this free speech. It's a threat to democracy now. And so what happened was the very same U.S. Intel State Department crap, Mike Benz calls it the blob, the very same people that championed free speech for years and years and years in democracy, all of a sudden after the election of Trump started to write articles about the danger of democracy. Then they realized, wait a minute, that looks really bad. So now they just changed what the meaning of the word democracy is. Democracy doesn't mean the will of the people, you the voter. Democracy means the will of the institutions. And so if 90% of people are against what the institution's consensus is, that's still a threat to democracy.
The Atlantic Council receives U.S. taxpayer funding from the State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA cut out, the Defense Department, the U.S. Marines, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, and numerous other federal agencies. Every single one of those provide annual funding.
So he's talking about the Atlantic Council, this organization we talked about, and the speech that they're going to give here. Notice how your money goes to pay for that. Your tax dollars are going for the very censorship of political ideologies that you stand for.
To influence and advance on the civilian side what the military, intelligence, and diplomacy sphere wants to be done at the geopolitical and military level. Okay? Now, another thing, I actually have a slide on this. Another thing to understand when you watch this, what we're about to watch, because we're going to be going deep on this. So I want you to don't look at this like these are just random people on a panel. Understand what this is, okay? The Atlantic Council has 7 CIA directors on its board. I don't know if you, maybe I can increase the zoom. Okay. A lot of people, and I say this all the time, but for people who are new here, I'm just going to.
So we talked about that. They have 7 former CIA directors. So he's going to go through that.
Do you guys see, I have to find a way to zoom this. Okay. I think this captures it. One sec. Do you guys see all these people? You see how there's a hashtag in the middle of the room? A social media hashtag? They're symbolically projecting the Atlantic Council has to control speech on social media. Social media is the problem because it's leading to the wrong people getting elected, and that's undermining the State Department's objectives and the Pentagon's objectives. And who they've gathered in the room are journalists from all over the world, from white shoe official media organizations, to train them in best practices on how to stop the flow of disinformation, i.e. anything that supports a populist candidate anywhere in the world. It's like a scene out of a twisted movie. Now, watch this again. 7 CIA directors, annual funding from all 4 branches of the U.S. military, plus the State Department. Now watch this, okay?
And just to start, we're going to come in with one of the most iconic quotes from one of the most iconic lead singers of all time.
Actually, I'm going to skip some of this ahead. I did clip this on a Rumble channel, but I don't want to do the ad, so I'm just going to...
Because whatever. Distort. If you don't like the evidence...
So he's going over the 4 Ds. And this is now like a framework, a formal framework.
So what Mike Benz is going to explain here is the Atlantic Council, again, funded by your tax dollars, former heads of the CIA on it, whose mission at this point is to instruct journalists as to how to flag for censorship posts that they consider disinformation. Now, Mike Benz is going to explain to you the formula they came up with to define disinformation. Now, I've talked about this at quite length. I didn't put it as specific as Mike Benz, which I appreciate his specificity here, and then going exactly what the Atlantic Council says. The truth of something is irrelevant as to whether or not it should be flagged as disinformation. Now, Mike Benz puts it a little more specific. He says there are 3 types of disinformation. There is misinformation, which is information that is incorrect, but you didn't know it. So if you think something's true and say it and it's wrong, that's misinformation. Disinformation is when something's incorrect and you know it was incorrect, so you intentionally lie. That is disinformation. The third is the most prolific and the one that they censor the most, and that is malinformation. Malinformation is truthful information that hurts these institutions.
But he came up with this framework, which is super useful to the censorship industry, and that they cite to this day in 2024. And it's called the 4 Ds of disinformation. Dismiss, distort, distract, dismay. So disinformation is not just something factually wrong. Look how devious this is. He's saying to flag something as disinformation, it doesn't have to be factually wrong. If it simply dismisses something that is right, or if it's as a kernel of truth, but it sort of distorts the truth, or if it's factually true, but it distracts from a larger truth, or if it's true, but it causes dismay, then all of those things are flaggable terms of service violation content in the bucket of disinformation. So, and again, I'm playing this because understand that the biggest bucket in the misdisinformation world is malinformation. Information that is technically true, but that undermines public faith and confidence in a government-backed initiative or a blob-backed initiative. Okay? Like, you guys probably saw this in the Twitter files when Renee DiResta sent in, or, the Stanford Air Observatory sent emails to Yoel Roth saying, Moondance, say those again, you're going to see it in the clip, but it's dismiss, distort, distract, dismay. And he's going to have the journalists chant it back to him and even train them. You're going to watch all this in a second, so just let me keep setting the stage. Understand that they are broadening the definition of disinformation to mean factually true information, which is now known as malinformation, that undermines a preferred blob narrative because its context undermines the narrative, even though its facts are true.
Now, I can't stress this enough. The reason that this is so important is that this is coming from the Atlantic Council. They're the ones who came up with this. They're the ones that are talking to journalists in this clip from 2019. The Atlantic Council, with 7 former heads of the CIA and the board of directors, that gets huge amounts of funding from your tax dollars, is instructing journalists how to censor right-wing populists like Donald Trump. How to and not only would this censorship apply to them pressuring social media, but also implicitly this would mean that the non-social media, but these journalists themselves, aren't going to cover stories fairly that they're being trained to flag as disinformation. You understand? So this is your tax dollars going to the Atlantic Council that has ties to NATO and to our intel agencies, with 7 former heads of the CIA talking to journalists. Now, why did none of these journalists speak up and say, my God, you should have saw what I was at? We're journalists. We're in this for the truth, for free speech. And we're being instructed by organization that has so many connections to the State Department and to NATO, that has 7 former heads of the CIA, how to pressure social media to censor people's First Amendment rights. Why did none of these journalists speak up? You'll see why. Because they're in on it. They're not pro-First Amendment. They're not pro-democracy. So let's go back to Mike Benz here.
So he's saying, I developed this initially to stop the Russians, but we can actually use it to stop pro-Trump sentiment.
This appears to be
Now, I know what you're thinking. Is he really saying pro-Trump sentiment? It blew my mind. What's about to come here blows my mind. Again, Atlantic Council, 7 former CIA directors, funded by your tax dollars. Basically the domestic arm of NATO and U.S. statecraft, talking to journalists about how to flag things as disinformation. That's what the entire speech is about. Originally, we cooked this up to go after Russians, but you could use it for other things. And you might say, really, or are they just talking about Russia? Wait until you see the examples they give of how to use this, right? So I can't stress enough. Again, these are the very groups that you would think would be the bulwark against this sort of corruption. Our own government paying for this, organizations that we've been told for decades were pro-democracy, pro-free speech, paying for this, and journalists who should be all about the truth and free speech, collaborating together to learn tools how to censor even truthful information if it hurts the regime. That's what's happening here.
a fairly generic model of the way in which witnesses will get attacked. There are many other ones, and we're about to play with this whole concept. So Andy will talk me through some of the rules.
Sure. So
now they're going to play a little game here. They're talking about censoring political and cultural ideas that they don't like. They're going to make it a game. You ready?
all of you should have some of these cards on the table. If you don't, look on another table and steal one that's not being used, because these are going to help get our attention.
You want to know what this card says? Now, they're handing out to these journalists these cards. They should all be on the table under your seats, etc. Did you see what the cards say? Did anybody get it? Mike goes into more detail. Look closely. I couldn't believe it. I was like, what's the card going to say? Is it going to have one of the 4 Ds on it? Look at what the card says. These are people that literally are promoting the censorship of you. And now they're going to play a game. And they gave out these very important cards to these journalists.
Witnesses will get attacked. There are many other ones, and we're about to
Pay close attention, see if you can see what this card says.
Sure. So, all of you should have some of these cards on the table.
Can you see that? Does anyone see what it says? I'm not kidding when I say how evil this is and how they're treating it like a game and how excited they are to censor people that disagree with them. That's right, it says bullshit. That's what it says. These are serious people with connections to the intel community, paid for by your government dollars, talking to serious people, legacy journalists, and they're going to play a little game on how can we censor people that we disagree with. And part of that game is we've given everyone a card that says bullshit. And we want you to wave this card in the air when you think you see a post that's bullshit. They're going to play a game. They specifically say it. We're going to play a game. You'll see. It is unbelievable.
If you don't look on another table and steal one that's not being used, because these are going to help get our attention. We are going to...
Do you see what that placard says? Sound from videos really weak? Okay. Let me add a gain filter. Let's see, is this better?
Showing quotes from different organizations and individuals who are using certain rhetorical devices to make their argument.
Okay. So he's saying we're going to do an exercise. Journalist in the room, journalist in the room, journalist in the room, journalist in the room, journalist in the room. Pentagon, CIA, and State Department spooks here, okay? And he's saying we're going to now, I, sponsored by the Pentagon, are going to train you, private sector independent journalists, to spot the rhetorical devices people online use to make their argument. That's what he said.
And so, if you go through all of them, at least one of these four will apply. Again, dismiss, distort, distract, dismay. Everyone say it with me. Dismiss, distort, distract, dismay.
Do you see this? Do you see what they just did? Do you see this? They are training these journalists like sheep. Say it with me. Dismiss, distort, distract, dismay. This is straight out of the same Saul Alinsky bullshit that you see when you see all these protesters from organizations like Black Lives Matter that just keep repeating slogans. It's not about free thinking. It's not about journalists trying to get what the truth is. It's about training them to just repeat mottos, to indoctrinate them, to justify them hating you and wanting you to be censored. Repeat the slogan. Repeat it to us, everyone. Can you imagine being a journalist that, maybe it was like, oh, these people are connected to intel agencies. They get tax dollars. It'll be interesting to see what they say about Russian disinformation. And all of a sudden they hand you a placard that has the word bullshit on it and then say, now repeat after us. Repeat the slogan. If you had any integrity, you would be looking around like, what the fuck? Is this out of 1984? What is happening? All of these journalists just repeating this government line? What is this bullshit? How is this holding truth to power? And yet they all do it. They all repeat it. It's unbelievable. Then you have to ask yourself, well, why is no one hearing about this? Why does it take a guy like Mike Benz to go through a public 18-hour conference that was publicly filmed and have to find a 40-minute section in it of just how corrupt this was? Why didn't any journalists report on it? Now you see. They're all the bleeding sheep that are involved with it. Yay! Great!
They are literally getting independent private sector journalists. The CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department are getting swarms of journalists to repeat back to them like bleeding sheep. Bah, bah. Say it with me. Say it with me. Distract, distort, dismiss, dismay. Obedience school is exactly right. NATO obediently training journalists to bleat back to them the censorship framework.
Excellent. I'm not going to ask you to do it backwards because that'll just mess all of you up. So we're going to go through each slide, and if you think you know which of the 4 Ds it is, we want you to hold up your card like this and get our attention.
The 4 Ds of
You're
disinformation.
welcome to scream, I call bullshit too, if you're comfortable, but it's not a requirement.
Did you hear that? He said you are welcome to scream the word bullshit, but it's not required. Because the placards, they have distributed to every single journalist. Look at there's like 200 journalists in this crowd surrounding an unholy hashtag at the center. And every single journalist has been given a placard that says the word bullshit on it. And NATO, the CIA, the Pentagon, and the State Department, the blob, is telling the journalists to take their state-issued bullshit sign and hold it up to the light on what you are about to see.
There will be occasions where it's more than just one of these 4. There could be 2, 3, perhaps even all 4 could be at play. And of course, if you look at every use of rhetoric in politics and persuasion and propaganda...
Use of rhetoric in politics and persuasion. Understand, we are way outside the jurisdiction of true or not.
Mike's absolutely correct here. He just said, we're going to look at things of rhetoric in political issues and persuasion. And how can we flag it as disinformation? Rhetoric in politics. Again, this isn't a debate class. that's like, oh, we'll teach you how to argue, and if someone says something, how to say that's not a good argument. This is a CIA NATO cutout funded by your tax dollars instructing journalists on how to flag posts for disinformation to get them censored. And what type of things will they be censoring? Political rhetoric. That's what. Political rhetoric. Remember, as Mike Benz was saying previously, what are they interested in censoring? Well, things like Brexit, things like Trump, things like Marine Le Pen, things like Nigel Farage, right-wing populism. It's not that what they're saying is necessarily not true. It just doesn't help democracy. And what is democracy? The will of the institutions currently in charge.
It's about stopping any kind of rhetorical ability to make your argument if it favors a populist political candidate. Again, this is the summer of 2019, a year and a half before the 2020 election, just so you understand how it was possible, because the Atlanta Council was the very first partner for Facebook's disinformation team, okay? And the Atlanta Council was the formal partner of the Department of Homeland Security to censor the 2020 election and COVID. I mean, again, you guys have no idea how deep this goes, but let's just keep going.
Today, there are going to be more techniques than these 4. And so we want you to put your thinking caps on.
Again.
And while we'd love to hear...
Put your thinking caps on and think creatively about how to censor the tweets you're about to see, citing any one of these 4 censorship rationales.
If you can come up with relevant uses of the 4 Ds. If there are other rhetorical tricks and devices you think are going on a particular quote, we'd love to hear from you. So with that, let's play.
Let's play.
I was shocked. I was like, oh, okay, what sort of tweets are they going to put up on the screen that they're going to say is some sort of disinformation? Is it going to be something about the Iraq War? Is it something about the funding of Ukraine? Is it something about Joe Biden being connected to Ukraine? Is it something about, specifically Mueller? Something like that? I was shocked. I'm going to tell you, I am shocked at what the first 2 tweets that they talk about. I was absolutely shocked. Even someone like me that understands how corrupt they were, I could not believe the tweets that they're about to put up. Now, I want to, again, lay the groundwork of what this is. They're saying the following tweets are dangerous disinformation that we need to train you to see that's disinformation so that you could pressure social media to censor them. Now, this is 2019, so it's before COVID. But you're thinking like, oh, they'll justify it by saying, well, it's important for the public health. For example, a tweet that says, actually climate change isn't real. It's all made up bullshit. They'll say, well, that's important because climate change could kill us all, blah, 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 blah. That's the stakes here. That's what the game they're playing. Hold up your bullshit placard. Tell us which of the 4 Ds that justifies this being censored. What are the tweets going to be? You ready? You ready? Because I was shocked. Absolutely shocked. It's going to be random Twitter users, right? It's going to be low-level random Twitter users. It's going to be Alex Jones type people, right? You ready?
Yes, okay, here we go. Let's play. Witch hunt.
Do you see what just happened? What's the very first tweet that they put out? Donald Trump saying witch hunt. I just want you to leave that soak in for a minute. This is dangerous disinformation that needs to be censored. This is 2019. The sitting president of the United States tweets the terms witch hunt in reference to the Russiagate investigation, which we now know was basically a witch hunt. It was a bunch of bullshit that didn't tie Trump to Russia in any way whatsoever. That was illegal. It was a witch hunt. The sitting president of the United States tweeting out 2 words, witch hunt. This NATO cutout, CIA cutout, paid for by your tax dollars to instruct journalists on how to censor disinformation. And the first tweet they put is the sitting president of the United States. Trump is the head of the CIA, the head of these executive branches. And his own people are taking your tax dollars to help undermine the president. That is unbelievable. Witch hunt. Wow, that's disinformation. How? Let's go on. I couldn't believe that that's all they had. Witch hunt? President of the United States. That's the very first tweet they put up. Again, they're training journalists to pressure social media to censor the President of the United States, saying they're out to get me on this Russia stuff and it's bullshit. Nope, you can't say that, Trump. You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say that, Trump. That should be censored from the American people.